generating more active response. Comments are spontaneously given during and after performances. Critical responses are sent into the world by means of the internet, and the winner of the Dutch and Belgium National Poetry Slam Championships is appointed by a clapometer, or by roses in Utrecht. Cultural expressions nowadays have a great variety of carriers. You can listen to a live concert on the train and watch a movie on your tablet. Poetry also has more carriers than ink on paper. For example, the voice, the digitized voice. This is Ramzi Nasser's collection of poetry on CDs, and he recites 850 poets from the Dutch poetry history. In public spaces, such as poems on public walls and poetry city walks. Moreover, poetry uses mixed media such as poetry and music. This is the CD Durf Jij by poet Ilja Leonard Vijver and singer Ellen ten Damme. Also poetry and graphic arts. This is the book Hauser, which you maybe know, which was a book and an exposition by poets and artists Annemarie Estor and Lies van Gassen. I think they come tomorrow.
And we have a little bit of a display covered in the hall of the book.
Cool. Poetry on the internet, for example, Thomas Oosterhoff's moving digital poems. Poetry and paper media, for example, newspaper blackout poems, which we call stiftgedichten. This one is by Dimitri Antonissen. Poetry and digital media, such as Google Poetry and Flav Poetry. And poetry and objects. In Holland and Flanders, Plint is very popular. The starting point of my research area is the year 1966. In this year, the poetry happenings Poëzieën Carré in Amsterdam and Poëzieën Paleis in Brussels introduced a more collective, democratic and interactive experience of poetry influenced by multimedia in the Netherlands and Flanders. Poetry off the page has of course existed much longer than that. Poetry originated orally and has existed in that form much longer than in the form which we now consider standard, written. And also poetry in public areas has been around for quite some time. In the Middle Ages, for example, poetry could be found on walls, doorposts, clothes and shoes. However, the combination of a collective democratic interactive experience and multimedia only emerged halfway the 1960s due to the expanding types of media. The above-mentioned happenings in Amsterdam and Brussels were, for example, broadcasted on TV and radio and shortly afterwards sold on LPs and books and in books. These events can be seen as the starting point in the Netherlands and Flanders of a culture in which literary experiences are manifested in off-the-page extensions such as Collins, Baricco and Marx describe. Poetry off the page is an intriguing type of poetry which I believe deserves more academic attention. There are many more forms and media which poets use to produce and spread poetry than the book. The production, reception and experience of these types of poetry have certainly grabbed my attention, so I will spending time off the page for the next 4 years. Thank you.
Questions? One thing I noted is about democratic, that you said going democratic. Do you see also poetry or literature going more democratic in the way of writing? Because now you're making a difference between writers and readers still.
Well, I would also really like to focus on the production of this type of poetry, and lots of people said, don't you want to include the research question, is poetry off the page, the poetry itself, different than poetry on the page? Do poets who produce more poetry off the page write significantly different poetry than on the page? And we had long discussions about that, but I think it's such a huge question, and I think it would be really difficult to make a real distinction between those two.
If you put it that way, first person that comes into my mind is Sven Alia.
Yeah. I also mentioned him in my proposal. Yeah. So Sven Adriaans is a Dutch poet who very consciously doesn't print his poetry, has not published a book, and says that he doesn't want to. He's a poetry slammer and he wants his poetry to stay on the stage. Yeah, definitely. But I think if you would give someone Sven Adriaans' poetry on paper or video, and then also give, I don't know, someone who doesn't perform a lot, which is quite difficult to find because it has lots of commercial aspects to perform also. But and then say, well, which one is which? Or give someone loads of. I don't think you would ever find. Do you understand what I mean? I won't find characteristics which are so exact that they only fit in one of the two.
Because what Sven Adriaans is very classical poetry.
Yeah.
It's a lot of metrum, it has a rhyme. Should more go then to Assyrian more to have very specific oral poetry. But he publishes also.
Yeah, and he publishes lots of CDs and on the internet, but he also publishes books where he works with typography.
What I was thinking of is specific, and it's not about participation, it's about the idea of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
It's poetry that is written by collectives, by working together between people, and that you don't see anymore, that you don't know anymore, that you cannot say anymore, this is the writer of that poem. And I'm thinking what Peter Bolt Hansen did in his city poems.
Mm-hmm.
There are some really working together with classes, working together with all of Antwerp, to send in sentences that he then put into one long poem, but also what he did with the Vrijgers at Kortrijk.
Yeah, that is interesting, like kind of community art type of poetry, yeah. Yeah, and that is something that is happening a lot. Also, DVB, a literary magazine here, who published that huge poem with 20 different poets who emailed each other lines, and they didn't publish in the poetry issue who had written which line, yeah. Yeah, I'm going to write that down, community art.
That's also something that is part of that democratic stance that is coming up this last decade, I think. Not in a, just a step further.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kat Georgia. I'm from New York, and I've been involved in this very issue for a long time. Since the very first time I drove down the freeway and I heard a poem on the radio, and I was so moved that I decided I must start writing poetry readings. That was in 1987, and since then I've been seeing tons of evolutions of these different things. One thing I found is that the slam format tended to make poetry more for entertainment value than it did for what I consider a page poem to have, which is a deeply felt, personal, non-victim oriented value. I think slam started changing the nature of poetry into a poetry form where victimhood was important, and because it got more response from people. Slam poets will tend to talk about their drug problems, their drinking problems, sexual abuse, and the more that happens, the more they get rewarded for these, and then all of a sudden everybody else wants the same reward, and so all of a sudden the nature of it, it doesn't become poetry anymore, it becomes entertainment for the purpose of winning this slam. So I just wanted to find out that I think that slams have done something like that, but I think rap has a very strong entertainment value. At the same time, rap has some of the greatest poetics of